Times roll. All right, so prayer, number one. Well, not number one, but number three, day number three. Back to another point we talked about a little bit at the beginning, which is prayer is not about you. All right? Prayer is about God. So, first thing, what do we know about God? What's one of the things we know about God that will influence our prayers? So that's how we pray. Sorry?
He gave up his life for us.
He loves us, yes. More fundamental, philosophical fact about God is God cannot change. He's eternal. Right? Can you change God's mind? James and John's mother tried to pull one on Jesus, get him to command. Right? So you're saying, I'm going to ask God, and then God's going to do what I want. Right? How do I convince God to do what I want? All right, so God cannot change. So prayer is not about changing God. Right? Prayer is about you trying to connect with God, not because you want to change God. And so that's one thing to remember, in the sense that you don't want to, some basics. Obviously this week's more advanced level, but some of the basics is, when you pray, you're not trying to change God's mind. You can't change his mind. You say, well, what's the point of praying then? All right. Well, it is true that God will answer some prayers only on the condition that you continue to ask, right? Some prayers are only, God has known from all eternity whether you pray for something or not, and therefore it's determined whether you get it. But it is true that some things you only get because you asked. In other words, God from all eternity knew you were going to ask, and therefore was going to give it to you. But he would not have given it to you if you had not asked. Right? So you're not changing God's mind, but part of God's plan is that you have to ask for things in order to get them. So it's good for us to ask, right? Number one, it makes us humble, right? If you got to ask for something, you have to acknowledge that you're not self-sufficient, right? That's why some people hate asking for directions, right? You know any men in your life?
Yeah, it makes me ask.
Makes you ask. He doesn't want to appear to be insufficient, not self-sufficient, right? If you ask him for something, that means you need something. That means there's something missing on your part. So it makes us humble to ask for stuff. Also, it makes us acknowledge where it comes from, right? Even if you, in your mind, you believe God was giving it to you, if you always got it, you just kind of assume, right? So not getting it every once in a while makes you more aware of that fact that God is the one giving it to you. So it's good to pray, to ask, right? So it's always good to pray. Another notion people have is that you shouldn't ask for things about yourself, right? Who's heard of that, right? Oh, I never pray anything for myself, right? Why is that bad? Well, you need help, right? If you don't ask for help, if you only ask for help for other people, then you're not going to get help for yourself, right? So it's either you're proud, you don't think you need the help, or more importantly, sometimes people think they don't deserve the help, right? Somehow it's better to pray for other people to get to heaven than to pray that you get to heaven, right? But it's love your neighbor as yourself, right? So therefore, if you love your neighbor enough to pray for them, then you should love yourself enough to pray for yourself, right? Because the more you ask from God, the more grace you get. Now, it might be true to not ask for less important stuff, because it might be a sign that you don't care about less important stuff. Dear Lord, make everybody love homily today. Right? I could ask for that, right? But in the long run, it's probably not that important. But I should ask that people listen to the homily, instead of not listen to the homily, but people who are listening to the homily tap into God's grace, or I could pray that I give a better homily. But anyway, so you're praying, it's good. Pray for yourself. Pray for good things for yourself. I think I've said this many times before, but always pray that you make it to heaven every day. Right? So one prayer guaranteed to be answered. All other prayers might not be answered. Right? You pray for your husband to make it to heaven. Your husband's got free will. You can decide not to cooperate. You can pray that you get to win the lottery. Well, we all know that that one's not always answered. Right? Don't need that. So some prayers God doesn't give you because it's not good for you. Some prayers you haven't prayed hard enough or you didn't persevere. But if you persevere in asking to go to heaven, that one's guaranteed to be answered. Key is persevere. You can't just do it once, right? So, woohoo! Pray the prayer, good, I can do whatever I want, I can have fun. But anyway, so always pray for your own salvation, pray for the salvation of others, etc. So it's good to pray, right? But you're not trying to change God, all right? But prayer is about God, connecting with God. Now, sometimes what people make is let's make a distinction between prayer and psychology, right? Or meditate. Sometimes people talk about, you need to meditate. It's like, oh man, my life is stressful, you got headaches, I'm always worried, and you're like, you need to meditate. Right? You know? You get like a little candle, you light the candle, you find a peaceful spot, you sit down, you clear your mind, you know, and then you feel better, right? So, psychology versus prayer. Psychology is about how you feel. Getting in touch with your feelings. Talking about yourself. Discovering your feelings. Letting go of your feelings. Letting go of your anxiety. You know, trying to figure out what's more important with you. Finding a peaceful place inside yourself, right? All that's got nothing to do with God. Might be good, might be helpful. People pay a lot of good money. Haven't done. But prayer is not about you getting in touch with your feelings. It's about getting connected with God. Right? So ultimately, how you feel, right, is not important. Because it's not about you, right? It's about connecting with God. Right? I always like to use the Eagles, but you got your Eagles fanatics, right? Football fans, right? They're like, Eagles, whatever. Anthony's not here, so I guess we won't root for Dallas. But if you're an Eagles fan, right, and the Eagles are winning the Super Bowl, and, right, the Eagles fan is more like focusing on the game, right? They're not trying to draw attention to themselves. But I'm not feeling this victory. Who cares what you feel? The Eagles are winning. It doesn't matter what you're feeling, right? The important thing is that the Eagles are winning. It's not important how you feel about yourself at the time. I don't necessarily feel good as a fan, or am I cheering good enough, right? The true fan is just focused on the game, right? If you're at an Eagles game and a bunch of guys sitting there and they're saying to themselves, do I cheer? Is my cheers good enough? Am I enthusiastic enough? I don't know if I'm really cheering from the heart, and the game's going on, they're like, dude, what are you talking about? It's the game, focus on the game, right? So, prayer is about God, not about yourself. So your feelings don't count, all that other stuff's not important. Ultimately, because it's about God, trying to connect with God, right? And the other thing people sometimes misread is that prayer, where is God? When you're praying, where is God? Where did St. Augustine find God? You read the Confession? Probably not. Anybody read the Confessions?
Wasn't that child in the ocean?
Okay, that was different. But inside, right? He said, I looked for you with the heavens, but you're actually inside. The whole time I was looking for you out there in your soul. Right? So if you're in a state of grace, we know theologically that if you possess sanctifying grace, then you possess intimate knowledge and love of God in your soul, as it were. In other words, you can connect directly with God. You have possession of God, as where you have access to knowledge and love of Him in your soul. So God's on the inside. So the goal is to connect with God on the inside. You're not looking for God on the outside. Right? So sometimes the problems misunderstanding people sometimes have is that and this connects with the other things I was saying. They're trying to impress God, right? Or they're trying to be good enough for God, or they're trying to arrange something for God. It's kind of like if you're putting on a show, you worry about your presentation. So, for example, if you're a comedian, right? You put on a show and you're in a bad mood, now you feel like laughing, right? You say, well, today's not a good day for the show. I'm going to cancel the show. I can't perform like I normally do, right? Sometimes when you think about prayer, it's like, I got to be on par. I got to be ready. I got to be rested. I got to be feeling good. I got to be peaceful, right? But if prayer is about connecting with God, it doesn't matter if you're upset when you're praying. It doesn't matter if you're distracted when you're praying. It doesn't matter if you're not feeling particularly prayerful, right? It doesn't matter if you have a splitting headache and you can't think. Well, if the goal is to connect with God, then it doesn't matter how you are doing, right? But if the goal was some kind of performance, like I'm going to read this and I'm going to feel devoted, I'm going to read, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to think about it, I'm going to generate, loving feelings and loving content, and I want to feel that. Well, that's putting the emphasis on you, right? But the emphasis on connecting with God, so you don't have to, the performance, you don't have to perform. You don't have to impress God. You don't have to be good enough for God, right? God already loves you. He's the one knocking at the door, waiting. He's already inside, waiting to talk to you, right? You don't have to impress him deciding to come visit you, because he's already on the inside. So, what are some of the practical things that these truths can teach us today? All right. Well, let's talk about yesterday a little bit with the distinction. So, yesterday we talked about meditation, or the idea where you use your mind to actively think about, and reflect upon things. Right. So there, you're using your mind. What you do is important because you got to use your mind, your human capacity to think about things. Right. But there's also that idea of prayer where you're just with God. Right. You also should. Meditation is useful, but it's also good to have just quiet time with God, one-on-one time with God. And in the sense of the one-on-one time with God, right, the key is God's on the inside, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. So that tells us something about distractions, right? What distractions, what's going on in your mind, what you're thinking, right? How many people have tried to pray, and then they were like, the brain was all over the place. But then, right? Mind's all over, and you think and then what was the first reaction? So oftentimes the first reaction. Gotta stop this, right? It's like, oh no, this is bad. Can't be doing this. This is a distraction. I gotta, and but that's not really, the distractions aren't really important. In fact, that whole surface level of your thoughts, your feelings, your anxieties, is kind of on the surface, right? And God's actually underneath, right? This priest, Father Liard, I think his name is, from St. Augustine, not from St. Augustine, but Villanova, right? He's an Augustinian. He teaches at Villanova. He talks about you being Mount Zion. There's an analogy about being Mount Zion. So if you are a mountain, right, your feelings, your thoughts are all, as it were, the weather, right? So if you're a mountain, does it bother you if it's raining? Now, if you're an ant, does it bother you if it's raining?
Yes.
Yes, that might be very dangerous. Giant lots, things falling out of the sky might kill me, right? But if you're a mountain, are you worried about the wind?
No.
You worry about the rain. No, that's all superficial. That's on the outside. Right? Doesn't matter if you got to cover your snow on there. So our soul is like Mount Zion, and your thoughts are like the weather. But God is actually in you, in the mountain, right? So the weather's on the surface. The goal is to go below that into you, connect into you, and then here's the key. Ignore what's going on in the surface. The goal is to ignore what's going on in the surface. Now, what does that mean? That means that, number one, you're not trying to stop it, right? Like, they say clear your mind. You gotta clear your mind and not think of anything. And then you try not to think of anything, and then you're thinking about not thinking of anything. Right? Right? The goal is not to not think of anything. That's too much work. The goal is to, as it were, see what's happening, the thoughts that are happening, ignore is the right one word, but just kind of not there, right? Another analogy, let me switch to TV, right? You know anybody who can have a long conversation with the TV on and it doesn't affect them at all?
Yeah.
Right? Now, it doesn't affect me. I'm ADD, right? So I'd be an example of something, the bad way of praying, right? You're trying to pray, trying to have a conversation, imagine God's in the room and you're talking to him, and the TV's on. Now, my brain, since ADD, every 2 seconds, would be like, look at that. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Oh, it's going to rain tonight. Like my brain, my ADD brain always focus on that. But there's other people that can have a whole conversation, right? And they're not even hearing it. Like, don't you hear that? I came home one time with my friend. He grew up with the TV, so brought him comfort. I go, what are you watching? He goes, huh? I said, what are you watching? What do you mean? The TV's on. It is? Yeah, can't you hear it? The TV's on. Oh, I didn't, I just turned it on, the background noise, right? Fill that background, right? In other words, some people have the ability to just, the TV's on, they're hearing it, but it's just not registered. And they can continue to talk to you. For other people, they can't do that. So same thing with God. You got these emotions going across, you got these ideas going across, right? And the goal is to ignore them, as it were, and just be at peace with God. So ultimately, the point is, it doesn't matter what distractions are going on, right? Now, what happens is, right, and this is also a point psychologists bring about. The goal, when you have an emotion for a psychologist, is not to react, but just to observe. Right? So in other words, you get angry, right? What happens is our brain will say something and then we'll react to that. Like, I shouldn't feel that way. Like, say you're praying and you have this idea like, I don't like God. And so you might be like, that's bad, I don't want to do that. But what have you done? You paid attention to it, right? You react. The goal is to let, if you imagine the guy uses it now, he teaches college kids, so he uses younger analogy, but like, videos, right? The people that get the YouTube videos on, they're always watching on their phone, right? All right, well, in your mind, as it were, you have those things playing in your mind. And the goal is not to react to it, not to make commentary about it. Oh, I shouldn't be thinking that. Ooh, that's bad, and that's not a good thought. I have to stop thinking this, right? Now we do that, we have an idea in our head, and then we react to it. Or we comment on it, like that's not a good idea. Or we feel bad about it, we shouldn't have that idea. So judge it, good, bad. Why am I having this idea? I don't need this idea. Maybe you left the toaster on. Oh no, I left the toaster on. Right? In other words, they're reacting to it. But in prayer, recollection, like I said, you can't get to the point where your brain is not thinking anything. But you can focus on the point where you go below into your soul. Right? But unfortunately for most people, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're desiring, that is reality for them. They associate themselves with that level. Right? So what I'm thinking, and that's why it's really hard for people not to judge themselves by the thoughts they're thinking. Because if you're only your thoughts, and you're only your desires, and fallen human nature, right? We got bad thoughts and bad desires and crazy thoughts. Then we think, well, I must be bad. God must not love me because I have all these bad thoughts and bad ideas. But if your thoughts are just the weather, and you're actually God's wonderful, beautiful creation, your soul, right? Remember, your soul is a spiritual entity created by God. There's your body, but there's soul. The soul is much deeper and much more a spiritual. Literally, your soul is worth more than all the stars and planets put together. Right? Has more value because it's a spiritual thing, right? So that reality, that's where God wants. That's where God dwells. He doesn't want to dwell on the surface with your images and thoughts kind of going across there. You want to dwell in between it. And so, one of the best ways, well, not the best ways, but when you're praying, distractions, right? The key is to ignore the distractions, right? Not to engage them. Now, you might try to, because when you respond, like if somebody wanted to keep you from doing something, right? And then they distracted you, right? Like, say you're, like all in the movie, like, it's like, oh no, if he presses that button, it's all over. Hey, don't press the button. And even if you yell at him, stop bothering me, I have to press the button, you're still not pressing the button, right? In other words, if you respond to so it's bad distractions are only bad when you willfully engage in them, when you freely choose them, when you don't want to go deep into your soul. Sometimes we don't want to do that. We don't really want to face God, so let's think about something else. We do that in life all the time, right? We're like, I don't want to face this thing. Let me think about, I got to fix this screw down here. Let me focus on that for the next half hour instead of think all the problems of my life. So when you pray, you got to not engage, right? And one of the things you can do is, it's called a Jesus prayer, is, so Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. A shorter version is, Jesus, have mercy on me, a sinner. Or my Jesus, my Lord, my God. And so by slowly repeating a phrase from Scripture, a word from Scripture, right, you just, that rhythm of repeating on that to just kind of, and then let all the other things kind of slide out, even though it exists, right? So keep going down into your soul, right? And so when you're praying, now adoration is a good opportunity to learn how to do this, is when you're engaging there, the recollection is just, as we're thinking of it, as sinking down into your soul, connecting with God, and not staying on the surface. Right? And like I said, one of the most important things you can learn is that this is not important. Right? The surface is not important. Underneath is important. Now, why is it important? Because that's where God is, right? That's where God is. The goal, you don't have to worry about getting this in order, right? You don't have to, God's coming over to my house, quick, we got to clean up the flower, we got to exhaust, right? God doesn't care about that. He's coming over to your soul, so don't worry about the outside. Just make sure you meet him in the soul, right? God's there in the soul already, and the more you focus on this, the less you can focus on the inside, right? So that's when you're like praying, connecting with God, right? Which, like I said, is different than meditation. Meditation is when you try to use your mind and think about it. So when you're distracted about that, that's why when you're reading a book, it gives you something to think about, right? But when you're sitting quietly with God, the goal is to let that part of your brain just kind of wander off. Kind of like, for those of you who had kids at church, right? Remember after Mass, you talk to your friends, right? What do the kids do? They just wander off, right? Like, Mom's not talking to me, They run around and, they kind of do their own little thing there. So when we're talking to God, sometimes our imagination and our mind just kind of wander around, right? Because they know, like, I'm talking to God, this part doesn't matter. Right? So maybe you can practice today if you have time, or the next day. Just letting, like you said, just letting it go. Treating it like background TV noise, if you could do that. Like I said, some people, I can't do that, but, you know, it just doesn't matter what's playing in the background because you're in here with Christ. Now, obviously, Christ is in the tabernacle and he is on the altar, but he's still gonna connect in your soul. Right? So he's physically in the room, but still spiritually connects via the soul.